The auction ledger lay open on the courthouse steps, and the number written beside her name was so small, the clerk read it twice, certain he had misheard. $41.60. A woman stood at the bottom of those steps with the deed in her chapped hands, and behind her, the whole of Merrow County agreed. She had bought herself a grave. 35 acres of bramble, so thick a deer could not push through it. A hillside no plow had touched in 20 years' land. The old-timers called the Devil's Napkin because nothing ever came off it clean. She had spent her last folding money on a thicket. And what none of them knew, what she did not yet know herself, was that under all that thorn and green, there waited a thing built of stone that would feed the very people now laughing at her back. 3 autumns earlier, before any of that, Della Hoyt had been nobody in particular. She was 26 years old, widowed young, when a mule kick took her husband, and left with nothing but a rented room over the feed store and a way of watching things that most people never bothered to learn. Her folks were long dead. She had no brothers to lean on, no name that opened doors, and in a county where a woman alone was regarded as a problem waiting to happen, that made her invisible in the useful way, the way that let her sit at the back of the tax sale and listen. She had been saving for 2 years, coin by coin, cleaning other people's kitchens and mending other people's shirts, and she had settled on one plain truth that the men around her had forgotten: land is land. Even ugly land sits on top of the same earth as the pretty kind, and ugly land, she had noticed, could be had for the price of a good pair of boots. So, when the auctioneer came to the Devil's Napkin and no hand went up but hers, she did not flinch at the snickering. She signed the ledger, took the deed, and walked home, already counting in her head what a body would need to live on nothing at all. The arithmetic was cruel, and she did it anyway, because doing it was better than despairing. $41 gone left her $9 and a handful of pennies. A sack of seed corn was $1.25. A used axe head, 50 cents. She could not afford a horse and would not have known where to keep one, so the clearing would be done by hand or not at all, and 35 acres cleared by one pair of hands was a thing measured not in weeks but in years. She sat that first night on a stump at the edge of her thicket, with a lantern between her boots, and looked at the black wall of thorn rising up the hill, and felt the size of her mistake settle onto her shoulders like a wet coat. But she had learned a thing in the years of scrubbing floors for people who scorned her. Despair is a tax you pay for imagining the whole mountain at once. So she looked only at the 6 feet of bramble directly in front of her, and she swung the axe, and she did not stop until the lantern burned low. 6 feet. It was not much. It was a beginning, and a beginning was more than the county had ever given her for free. It was old Thomas Wenzel who found her out there on the 3rd morning, cutting at the thorn with her hands wrapped in rags gone brown with blood. He was a Bohemian who had come over as a young man with nothing but a satchel of seeds sewn into his coat lining, and he farmed the sour bottom land below her hill, land everyone said was drowned but which somehow always gave him cabbages the size of a child's head. He watched her a while from the fence line, and then he said in that slow, accented way of his, that a person who fights the land with an axe will lose, because the land is patient and the person is not. She told him she had no money for anything but an axe. He nodded, as if that were the wisest answer she could have given, and then he said the thing she would carry for the rest of her life. The land does not care what a thing looks like. Girl, the land only cares what a thing does. And a thorn, he said, is only a wall, until you find the animal that eats walls. Then he told her about pigs. She had $11 and change, and she spent nearly all of it on 4 half-wild shoats that a farmer, 3 valleys over, was glad to be rid of. Ill-tempered lean things, with backs like the ridge of a barn, and snouts like iron shovels. Everyone told her a pig was a foolish beast for a woman with no fences and no feed, that they would run off or root up whatever little she managed to plant and leave her poorer than the thorn had found her. But Tomas had told her the secret the mockers did not know. A hog does not eat grass like a cow that must be led to a pasture. A hog reads the ground with its nose. It will drive that snout down through thorn and root and rot chasing the sweet things buried underneath, and in the chasing, it will tear open in a single afternoon what a person would spend a week hacking at. She penned them at the very base of the hill with brush and stakes, and she moved that pen up the slope a few yards every few days, and the pigs did what pigs were made to do. They ate the walls. By June, she could stand where the lantern had sat that first black night and see clear up the slope, because the hogs had rooted a raw brown scar through the middle of the thicket, turning the thorn under and churning the dirt into something a seed could take hold of. The work was not clean, and it was not fast, but it was hers, and it was happening. She planted the turned ground behind the pigs as they climbed, corn and turnips and beans. And she kept the arithmetic banked low under the ash of her chest where the town could not see it. She told no one that the first turnips came up fat. She told no one that the corn stood green and even in soil that was supposed to be cursed. When Ada Pruett from the mercantile passed on the road and called out, mockery dressed up as concern, that Della must be lonesome up there with only pigs to talk to, Della only smiled and said the pigs were fine company and did not mention that they had earned her more in 2 months than Ada's husband earned in a year. Being right, she was learning, was its own kind of reply, and it did not need to be spoken to be true. It was in the last week of that same June that the hogs found the stone. Della had moved the pen to a shelf of ground about 2/3 up the hill, a flat place where the thorn grew densest of all, so dense that she had privately dreaded reaching it. The biggest of the 4, a boar she had, taken to calling Cornelius, spent a whole afternoon fixed on one spot, grunting and heaving, driving his snout down and down, until she went over to see what had him so possessed. He had rooted away a foot of black leaf rot and thorn root, and there, under his muddy nose, was a cut and squared stone, not a field boulder. A worked stone, its face flat, and its edge true. The kind of stone a man shapes with a chisel and sets with intention. She knelt down and put her bleeding hand flat against it, and felt, under the June heat, that the stone was cold. Cold the way a cellar is cold. Cold the way a thing is cold when there is an empty space behind it holding the winter in. She spent 3 days digging that stone free with a spade and her hands, and what came up out of the hill was a building. Not a ruin exactly, but a squat, thick-walled structure of fitted fieldstone, buried to its eaves by 40 years of bramble and slid earth, its low door choked solid with root. When she finally pried that door open, a smell rolled out at her that she knew at once and could not, for a moment, believe. Under the mildew and the cold and the mouse dirt, faint but unmistakable, was the ghost of wood smoke and salt and cured meat. It was a smokehouse. A stone smokehouse, built to last 100 years by hands long dead, its iron hooks still fixed in the blackened beams overhead, its firebox intact, its walls so thick and so tight that the heat and the smoke had once hung in it like water in a jug. Thomas came up the hill when she sent the neighbor boy to fetch him, and he stood in that low doorway with his hat in his hands like a man in a church, and he said that in the old country only a rich man had a smokehouse of stone, and here the county had sold one to a girl for $41 because they were too proud to look under the thorns. Now, here's a truth about towns and about people that the tale has been circling toward. It is easier to believe a thing is worthless than to admit you were a fool to overlook it. When word crept down the hill that the Hoyt woman had found some old stone shed in her brambles, Merrow County did not marvel. It scoffed harder. A pile of rocks, they said. A tumble down that would fall on her head. What did a widow think she was going to do with a hole in a hillside? But Della was not listening to them anymore, because she had already done her arithmetic, and the arithmetic was singing. A working smokehouse meant she could take a hog, her own or another man's, and turn it into hams and bacon and shoulder that would keep through a whole winter without spoiling, and cured meat did not sell for the price of a live animal. It sold for 3 times that, 4 times, because someone else had done the salting and the smoking and the waiting. She had the pigs. She had the house. What she needed now was to remember how her grandmother had done it and to be patient, which was the one thing she had in endless supply. She butchered her first hog in the cold snap of that November, the fat one after Cornelius, and she did it the slow way, the way Tomas half remembered, and her own hands half remembered from a childhood she had thought forgotten. She rubbed the meat with salt she could barely afford, and hung it on the old iron hooks, and she kept a low green fire of hickory smoldering in the firebox for days on end, sleeping in the doorway wrapped in a horse blanket so the fire would never die and never flare. It was hard, watchful work, and the smoke got into her clothes, and her hair, and the corners of her eyes, until she wept without sorrow. But when she took that first ham down and cut into it, the meat inside was rose-dark and firm and smelled of salt and hickory and thyme, and she stood alone in that stone room, built by a dead man, and ate a slice off the point of her knife, and had to sit down on the cold floor because it was the finest thing she had ever tasted, and she had made it. And no one on earth could tell her she had not. The first believer came from outside, as believers so often do, because a town is the last to see the worth of what it lives beside. A man named Silas Rekarek ran a hotel dining room in the county seat, 30 miles off, and he prided himself on a table that drew travelers off the rail line. He had heard, through the merchant who bought her surplus turnips, that there was a woman in Marrow, curing hams the old way, and one gray afternoon he drove his buggy up her rutted road, tied his horse, and asked to taste. Della cut him a slice with the same knife she had used on that first ham. She watched him chew it slowly, watched his eyes go still and inward the way a person's eyes go when they are tasting something and remembering something at the same time. He asked her, quietly, how many she could make. She told him the truth, that she had 4 hogs and 1 house and 2 hands. He said he would take every ham she could cure at $1.50 the ham, and he would take her bacon besides, and he asked, almost shy, whether she understood what a thing like this was worth to a man like him. She said she was beginning to. He shook her hand as if she were a person, which was a rarer courtesy in her life than he could have known, and he drove off with 3 hams wrapped in cloth on the seat beside him and a promise between them. Word of a paying buyer does what mockery cannot. It travels fast, and it changes faces. By the following spring, the same neighbors who had called her thicket a grave were finding reasons to walk their road past her hill, calling up friendly questions, remarking how they'd always said that old place had good bones. Ada Pruitt sent up a pie. A farmer who had laughed loudest at the tax sale came around with his hat, literally in his hand, to ask whether, seeing as she had that fine stone house doing nothing all summer, she might smoke a few of his hogs come fall, for a fair share, of course. And here Della might have grown hard. She had earned the right to be hard. She had bled into that thorn, while they warmed their hands at their own hearths, and pitied her. But she remembered another piece of Tomas's slow wisdom offered one evening over his cabbages, that a person who is proven right and turns it into a whip only proves the town was right to fear them. So she told the farmer, yes. She would smoke his hogs for a fair share, not a greedy one, and she named a price so square that he blinked, and she gained a neighbor where she might have kept an enemy. But the land, as Tomas always said, is patient and does not hand out fortune without also handing out a test, and the test came in the 3rd summer, and it came dry. The spring rains simply did not fall. The creek that fed the low fields shrank to a thread, and then to a string of stagnant pools, and the sky over Marrow County went a hard, cloudless, cruel blue that the old men watched with their jaws set. The corn in the valley curled and browned at the edges and did not tassel. Wells that had never failed gave up mud. And the hardest blow of all fell on cattle, for a cow is a creature of the green pasture, and when the pasture turned to dust, the cattlemen who had always looked down on hogs and hog farmers watched their herds go gaunt and bawling, watched their whole year's wealth wither on the hoof, with nothing to sell and nothing to feed. Hunger, when it comes to a proud place, comes quietly at first. It comes as a family eating a little less at supper. Then it comes as a farmer selling a wagon he cannot pay to keep. Then it comes to the door. It came to Della's door in the shape of the very farmer she had shaken hands with, the one whose hog she'd agreed to smoke, and he stood on her step gaunt and gray and could not meet her eyes. His cattle were dying, he said. His children were thin. He had heard she had meat cured and hanging, put by against the winter, and he had nothing left to trade for it but a threadbare pride he was choking down as he spoke. Now, hear the shape of the temptation, because it is the true crossroads of the tale. Della had a stone house, half full of cured hams and bacon that would not spoil, in a county where every other larder was going empty, and every honest thing was suddenly worth a king's ransom. Silas Recarick had already sent word up from the county seat that with the drought he could pay double, triple, for anything she could send him, and he had said it plainly, that a smart woman would sell high now, and let the sentimental starve. She could have made herself rich on that hillside, off the desperation below it. The arithmetic, cold and gleaming, was right there in front of her, and no one would have blamed her, for the whole world says a thing is only worth what a person is desperate enough to pay. She looked at the farmer on her step, and she looked past him down the hill at the brown dead valley, and she made her choice. She did not send her meat off to the county seat to be sold to travelers at 3 times the price. She took a ham down off the hook and put it in the man's arms and told him it was not charity, because charity shames a proud man, and she would not do that to him. She told him instead that his hogs still needed smoking, that her stone house was worth nothing standing empty, and that a county that let its neighbors starve while one woman got rich on a hillside was a county not worth living in. Then she did a thing that no one had thought to do, because they had all learned to think of themselves as one person alone against the dry sky. She walked down her hill for the first time in years, and she went from house to house, and she told them that her smokehouse would take any animal any family could spare from a dying herd and turn it into meat that would keep, so that a cow that would rot in a week on the parched ground could feed a family clear through to spring. It was a simple thing, and it was the whole answer. A cattleman with a starving beast had faced a choice between watching it die on the hoof or slaughtering it, and watching the meat spoil in the heat within days, for it was too hot to keep, and there was no ice to be had. But Della's stone house, buried under thorn and bought for $41, held the cold and the smoke the way it had held them for a dead man's family a lifetime before, and in it, fresh meat became cured meat, and cured meat became a winter survive. She smoked for the whole valley that terrible summer, and into the fall, sleeping again in the doorway with the horse blanket and the low hickory fire, her eyes weeping smoke, taking as her share only enough to keep herself, and turning away no one. The men who had scorned her hogs now drove their gaunt cattle up her hill with something in their faces that was not mockery and not even gratitude exactly, but the harder, humbler thing that comes when a person understands at last that they had been wrong in the very bones of their thinking. There was one more who came up the hill that autumn, and he did not come humbled. He came smooth. His name was Mercer, and he was a land agent out of the city, well-fed in a lean season, wearing a coat that had never touched a thorn, and he had heard, the way such men always hear, that there was money moving on a hillside in a starving county. He looked at her stone smokehouse and her fat, contented hogs and her hill of turned black earth green with a second planting, and he smiled a warm false smile and told her she had done wonders for a woman alone, truly wonders, but that she must see how precarious it all was, one bad winter from ruin, and that he was prepared, out of pure regard for her situation, to buy the whole 35 acres and the house and stock for a sum that he named as though it were a mercy. It was more money than Della had ever held. And he made a small mistake the kind greed always makes. He leaned in and said kindly that a place this valuable was no burden for a lone woman to carry through the hard years surely to come. She looked at him a long moment, and she asked him how he had come to know the place was valuable, seeing as the whole county had sworn for 20 years it was a grave. He started to answer and stopped, because he had let the truth slip, that he had come precisely because it was worth having, that men like him only ever appear when the scorned thing has quietly become the prize. And she understood the shape of him then, and she was not afraid, because she had faced down the dry sky and the thorn, and her own despair, and a soft man in a clean coat was nothing beside those. She told him, no. She told him the land only cared what a thing did, and this land, this house, was doing more than any money he could offer, because it was keeping a whole valley alive, and she would not sell the one true thing that had ever belonged to her to a man who had watched from a clean distance and come only when it was safe to profit. She told him the road down the hill was the same road up, and Mercer, who had expected a grateful widow, found instead a woman the drought had forged into something he could not buy, and he took his warm false smile back down the rutted road and did not return. Now the county remembered this too. Word went round of how the Hoyt woman had sent the land agent away with nothing while her neighbor's meat hung safe in her stone house, and the last of the old mockery died in the throats of the people who had carried it, because it is one thing to scorn a person who is down and quite another to keep scorning them once they have fed your children. When the rains finally came the next spring, soft and gray and merciful, the valley planted again and the cattle came back, but nobody in Merrow County ever again called the hill the Devil's Napkin. They called it the Hoyt Place, and they said it the way you say the name of something that has proven itself, with a small, unconscious respect. Silas Recarick kept buying her hams for his hotel table at a fair and steady price, and the farmer she had refused to shame sent his sons up every autumn to help her with the butchering for wages, because she insisted on paying them, and the boys came to love that smoky stone room and the low, patient work of it as if it were their own. Old Tomas Wenzel lived long enough to see it all, and one evening near the end of his life he sat with Della on the stump at the base of the hill where the lantern had once burned low, over a woman certain she had ruined herself, and they looked up the slope at the green orderly rows and the pig's fat in their shifting pen and the stone house with its thread of blue smoke rising straight up into a windless dusk. He said again, slow and content, the thing he had told her at the beginning, that the land does not care what a thing looks like, only what it does, and that a thorn is only a wall until you find the animal that eats walls. And Della, who had been a nobody with $41 and a deed to a grave, who had bled into the thicket and slept in the smoke and refused to grow rich on her neighbor's hunger, understood that he had been speaking of more than pigs. He had been speaking of her. She had looked worthless to the whole of Merrow County, cheap enough to laugh at, and all the while there had been something buried under the surface, something built to last, waiting only for the patient work that would root it down to the stone. And there it stood, on the hill they had all thrown away, feeding the very people who had laughed, its smoke rising steady into the falling dark, like a thing that had always known its own worth and had only been waiting, all those buried years, for someone stubborn enough to dig it out.